Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, COVID-19 cases are on the rise across Europe once again. I'll be discussing the economic implications of this, as well as the UK-EU AstraZeneca fallout with the journalist Alex Fraser, who'll be joining us from Milan, Italy. And in case you missed it, Monday was World Water Day. Kate Lamb, the Global Director of Water Security at CDP, will be talking about their charity's recent findings, which warns that hundreds of billions of dollars is at risk unless companies change the way they use the substance. Then later, I'll be reporting on the biggest company news stories of the week. Before then, let's start the programme with news from here in the UK. Earlier in the week, Britain's job market showed signs of improvement in January, with the first drop in unemployment since the coronavirus pandemic spread a year ago. There was also a positive picture painted from flash PMI data for March, revealing that the UK economy rebounded following 2 months of decline. This decisive outlook has been overshadowed, however, by a dispute over a possible block of exports on coronavirus jabs to the UK. The Prime Minister has said he has been reassured by talking to EU partners over the last few months that they don't want to see blockades. He also stressed that the UK was on course with its roadmap for lifting lockdown restrictions over the next 3 months. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by our business correspondent, Simon Pusey. Simon, we spent months last year talking about the EU Brexit row, and now it appears to be another row, but this is much more serious.
Yeah, it's really interesting, this. It's all about the supply of mainly AstraZeneca jabs to the EU and to Britain, and it comes down to contracts, seemingly, that were signed by both parts. Now, Ursula von der Leyen has been saying recently that the bloc does have the power to stop sending vaccines that are made on European soil to the UK, and a couple of days ago, Boris Johnson spent a few hours calling up a lot of European leaders trying to say, hang on a minute, this sounds a bit childish and isn't really fair, given we're sort of friends and neighbours, is what he used to say always during the Brexit debate, didn't he? But there seems to be two sort of sections here. There's the location of these factories. There's one in the Netherlands, for example. There's two in the UK that are AstraZeneca owned or run manufacturers. And then the other is this contracts thing. So it seems like that the good thing the UK have done is in signing the contracts, there's a clause that says they can't give these vaccines to any other countries while the UK still has as many as one person that hasn't had their jab. The EU has signed a contract with AstraZeneca too, but it doesn't have this clause in there. So it literally seems to come down to just the UK thinking a little bit maybe smarter and saying we want the vaccines first, which I guess in a way takes out the moral responsibility because, well, it's in writing and it is just a contract. But the EU is saying that this isn't really a battle between the EU and the UK. This is a battle between the EU and AstraZeneca and the UK and AstraZeneca, because on top of all this, AstraZeneca haven't shone themselves in great light. Firstly, there's a couple of things around the testing of the vaccine. We've heard about blood clots recently. But the way they've released their results has been questioned, and the kind of virility of those results has been questioned. And that means that even if the EU were to have all of their doses of AstraZeneca, a lot of people aren't taking them up because people like Emmanuel Macron have questioned the AstraZeneca thing. Also, they've obviously overstated their supply. They've said to the EU and to the UK, yes, we can meet our commitments, but it looks like they can't. So I think there's a few things going on here. And yeah, one EU official saying that this is not anything to do with the UK or the EU isn't to blame. It's about everyone finding agreement with a company that has been overselling its production capacity. So a lot going on there. If we just quickly move on to lockdown, we're a couple of days away now in the UK from restrictions easing again. It's after the third national lockdown, of course. March the 29th is the next big date, and there's 5 weeks in between these big dates. And that means that up to six people can gather outside. We've been here before. kind of last summer, feels like a long time ago. And in support bubbles, people can meet indoors. So 2 people can meet indoors if they're in support bubbles. This is all kind of jargon, isn't it, really? But it's sort of important here, I think, especially for the economy as well, getting people out and about as the sort of summer weather creeps in a little bit. And then a couple of other things. Sports facilities will be able to open. People can play organised sport outdoors. So a slight return to normality in the next few days.
If that third wave doesn't come. Thank you, Simon. Let's get a view from the continent now, where there has been a significant rise in infections across the region. Renewed fears have led to renewed restrictions. In Germany, the weekly infection rate per 100,000 people stood at 107 nationwide on Monday, up from figures in the mid-60s 3 weeks ago. Among the new restrictions is a requirement for all travellers to be tested for COVID-19 before boarding flights to the country. A slow vaccine rollout has forced French authorities to reimpose lockdown measures in 16 areas, including Paris, affecting about 21 million people. Non-essential shops are required to close, inter-regional travel is prohibited, and the nationwide nightly curfew is being moved back an hour to 7 p.m. local time. It will be a muted Easter for Italy, with a total shutdown across the country from the 3rd to the 5th of April. People will have to stay at home except for work, health or other essential reasons. More than half of the country, including Rome and Milan, is already under restrictions imposed on the 15th of March, which saw restaurants and schools once again closed. For more from the European continent, I'm now being joined by the video journalist Alex Fraser, who's joining me from Milan, Italy. Alex Fraser, thanks so much for joining me on Channels Business Global. Oh my goodness, it's almost a year since we last spoke. You don't seem as dishevelled now. I think things were getting better, but it appears as if there is a third wave that's creeping its way across Europe. Can you tell us what's the situation on the ground in Italy and across the continent?
Well, the situation here, to be honest with you, is not that dissimilar from this time last year in terms of the numbers. Of course, there's much wider track and testing and that sort of thing. So we have a much better idea of how many cases there are now. Italy's currently at a stage when around 500 people per day are dying from the virus, and many intensive care units are filling up. The difference this time is obviously the vaccine program has started. So it's clear that in the most vulnerable categories, we're not seeing so many deaths, but the situation still isn't great. And across Europe, this wave of more infectious variants is obviously a major problem. And you're seeing new lockdowns, which look like they're going to be in place over Easter, certainly here, and longer in places like Germany and France, which are looking at up until mid-April. So it's a different situation on the continent from Britain, which seems to have got through its worst part of the second wave, we think. But here we're seeing a third wave, and particularly with that British variant of the virus.
Absolutely. I've got to say, an average of 500 deaths a day is still pretty high, isn't it, Alex? I think earlier this week in Britain, well, in England at the very least, 17 deaths were recorded. Obviously, every loss of life, we send our condolences, don't we? But it's still pretty high. And Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, has said that third wave could potentially roll up on our shores. I've got to ask you about a big topic that's dominating headlines here in the UK, which is this AstraZeneca blockade. Ursula von der Leyen is not really getting any friendly headlines here from the tabloids. But what is the truth to that? Because I've got to tell you, how it's being reported here is if it seems as if there's been a botched job by the EU. Last week, they put the entire world in the frenzy because they decided to suspend AstraZeneca. They were very slow to regulate. We've seen pictures across the internet of some of these vaccination centres being pretty much empty, but now they appear to be taking it out on the Brits.
I think the case in Europe is there are some truths to all those things you said, but then there are also some exaggerations. The fact is, AstraZeneca failed to meet the delivery targets on the continent in the EU, but they did make them in Britain. And that's caused a number of issues. And of course, the latest one being this potential vaccine blockade. But of course, this debate with AstraZeneca goes back into January. We had President Macron of France had very public doubts about the efficacy trials of AstraZeneca, and many countries in Europe have banned use of it in certain older age groups. And unfortunately, what that has done is it's created this debate about public trust in the AZ vaccine. And we've obviously seen these blood clotting deaths recently, which have, I can say, there's been no proven link made between those deaths, but they were people who had taken the AstraZeneca vaccine. And that led to that temporary ban we saw last week from the German, French and Italian governments. That here in Italy, after some of those deaths, one in Sicily and one up in Biella, which is in the north in Piemonte, they created legal cases. And in Italy's very bureaucratic legal system, that's meant that some of those AstraZeneca doses have been impounded. Talking about the vaccine program in general, it's obviously been a very slow start on the continent, and particularly here in Italy. There's been many problems in the region I live here in Lombardy in terms of getting appointments to people. It's a very different system. I know in Britain, the NHS basically has a database and sends out messages when you're ready. Here, it's done regionally. It's very different. People have to apply for their slot. At the start, we had big issues of older people, their relatives having to do online queuing for them because, of course, many older people aren't using the internet in the same way here. So there's been major issues in terms of that side of the rollout. But the biggest issue, I think, is the public confidence, because once you withdraw a vaccine for a few days, it becomes very difficult to encourage people that it's then safe, it's okay, and to take that up. And that's a major issue that we're having here in Italy. The other issue is certainly in terms of who gets the vaccine. So in Britain, I know that it's gone very much for the age groups, the vulnerable category, and then it goes on to the next age group. Well, here it's been quite confusing. Right now, many older people are getting Pfizer, but they're in the oldest age group still, 70s to 80s. And still some people 80 plus still haven't been vaccinated. And whereas the AstraZeneca vaccine here is tending to be used for teachers. So you have a strange situation where you're getting vaccinations based on profession here right now, as well as these age groups. So many older people still haven't been vaccinated, but some young people in there who are in the least vulnerable categories have been. So all these things have created issues. Onto the export controls of these vaccines. Today, there's been some latest news here, which is there are 29 million AstraZeneca doses believed to be outside of Rome in a factory. And the talk here is that those were supposed to be heading to Britain. So it very much depends on what will happen with the EU in the next few days about where those doses go. But there's certainly bad feeling across the board. But we shouldn't forget that these vaccines have a very, very complicated production chain involving multiple countries. And if the EU does exercise some kind of export ban, it will affect both Britain and the EU and other countries outside of them. And even Pfizer, who obviously produce an alternative vaccine to AstraZeneca, they have said they don't want to see any kind of ban because some of their parts of that vaccine are made in Britain. So it can cause problems either way.
Goodness, no surprises there. It is the biggest immunisation drive possibly in history. Before I let you go, Alex, I've got to ask about the mood music in Italy at the moment. It looks picturesque, I've got to say, where you are. But I know that feelings obviously are never picture perfect. We've had a few spats, pockets of protests here in Britain. Lots of people not happy, including backbench MPs, about, this raining down on their civil liberties. What is the feeling? Because we know Italy suffered quite immensely in the first wave. I suppose people are just sick to death of COVID, aren't they?
In many ways, yes. I think in the first wave, it was such a shock and a huge wave of death here in Italy. But actually, more people died in the second wave than the first, which may seem very, very strange to others because, of course, of the publicity and the news at the time. But that was because Italy was the first country in Europe really suffering from this. But you've got a situation with the economy that you've got many people on furlough still. A third of Italy's workforce are on furlough. That's going to end at some point. Currently, there's a ban on all redundancies. But these things you feel like are queuing up problems for later on in the year. There's a potential 300, 400,000 jobs at risk immediately. This economy here runs on small business, and many of those haven't received full support, or to get it, they have to navigate huge levels of bureaucracy. So there's lockdowns create huge problems for the Italian economy because it is based on person to person, small businesses, and all these things. Of course, in a lockdown, you can't do it, and this country is not set up for online business in the same way because of many of the hurdles of the bureaucracy here. So all these things contribute to bad times ahead for the economy.
Alex Fraser, video journalist, thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Coming up on Channels Business Global, I'll be speaking with Kate Lamb, the Global Director of Water Security at CDP, about the global water crisis. See you after the break. Welcome back to Channels Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. In a moment, I'll be speaking with Kate Lamb, but before then, here's some company news for you. The boss of Qantas Airlines has said that the Australian government is going to insist on vaccines for international travellers, and the policy would be legislated as a condition of entry. Australia has closed its borders to almost all foreigners over the past year. Alan Joyce, the chief executive of the national flag carrier, said he thinks passengers would be willing to accept the change. In the second half of 2020, Qantas lost £580 million. That compares with a profit of £430 million in the same period last year. Last month, Qantas pushed back the date at which it expects its international flights to resume from July to the end of October. Warner Music and Tencent Music Entertainment Group have announced that they have expanded their long-running licensing relationship, which will include partnering on a new joint venture record label targeting the lucrative China market. The iconic American record label said the venture with China's dominant online music platform will help make its artists, which include Burna Boy and Ed Sheeran, impossible to ignore. Rival companies Universal Music and Sony have also struck similar deals in the region. In 2019, China accounted for just 3% of the $20 billion global revenues made by record companies. But this is all set to change thanks to the rise of streaming services. Twitter founder and chief executive Jack Dorsey has sold a digital certificate connected to his first ever tweet for over £2 million. It was purchased in an auction by Sina Estavi, a Malaysian-based entrepreneur who claimed the digital certificate is not just a tweet. The tweet itself, which said, "Just setting up my Twitter," was made on the 21st of March in 2006. Dorsey said the funds raised are being donated to a charity supporting the coronavirus response in Africa. The 15-year-old social media app has a market value of $61 billion and over 340 million active users. Now over to our next topic. On Monday, humanitarian organisations from across the world celebrated World Water Day during an online event. The theme from this year is the value of water, which varies for households, businesses, communities and regions. One of the main purposes for marking the day is to raise awareness about the global water crisis. The UN has forecast that within the next 10 years, up to 700 million people could be displaced by intense water scarcity. And the not-for-profit charity CDP have just released a report warning that hundreds of billions of dollars is at risk unless companies reduce the amount of water they use to run their thirsty organisations. To discuss this, I'm now being joined by Kate Lamb, the Global Director of Water Security at CDP. Kate Lamb, thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global. On Monday, it was World Water Day, celebrated across the world. And now one of the goals is to raise awareness about the global water crisis. I'm sure for many of our viewers, they may not know there is a water crisis. Can you tell us the scale of the issue?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me on today. As you rightly said, water really, the water scarcity crisis is really an invisible crisis, arguably one of the most important crises that nobody is talking about. And I'm really pleased that we've got an opportunity to change that today. I think first it's worth remembering that fresh water is a finite resource. Despite the fact that our Earth, 97% of our Earth is covered by water, most of it is too salty for us to use, or it's in the wrong place for us to use. In fact, of that 97%, just 1% is readily available for us to use for drinking water or to produce our food or to power our industries. And another important factor to remember about water is that unlike fossil fuels, for which we have alternatives such as sun, the wind, or the waves, there are no alternatives to water. We're stuck with what we've got. And while the term water scarcity is often used, what we're really experiencing is water competition. So as population grows, demands for this finite and irreplaceable resource have increased to such an extent that the amount of fresh water available per person across the world has dropped by a fifth in just 20 years. And this situation is resulting in around 3 billion people being affected by water shortages worldwide every day.
Quite frightening, actually, Kate, but it's a good thing that we're using this week to raise awareness about the issue. There are several reports that have been released, and I know that your organisation have released a report warning that hundreds of billions of dollars are at risk unless companies reduce the amount of water that they use and innovate in ways of saving water. Can you tell us how you managed to reach these figures?
Absolutely. So CDP, we're not necessarily a household name, but we were recently branded by the Harvard Business Review as one of the most influential green NGOs that you've probably never heard of. But we operate a disclosure mechanism on behalf of around 520 institutional investors. So these are mainstream financial institutions such as BlackRock or HSBC or Goldman Sachs. And they ask CDP, give us permission to require companies around the world to disclose how this situation with regards to water security is likely to affect their business. So this year we had almost 4,000 corporations worldwide, from Unilever, L'Oreal, Dell, Ford Motor Company, disclose information to us about how this situation is likely to affect their business both today and into the future. They themselves are disclosing that there are around $301 billion worth of risks facing their business unless the situation with regards to water security, both quantity and quality, are addressed.
An interesting term that I just picked up this week from conducting some research in CDP is water-thirsty companies. Can you just describe what a water-thirsty company is like? You know, how are they wasting water? And I suppose it's not, just having it in the staff office, is it? You know, it's something that you can use to have a cup of coffee and tea, which we need. I've had a couple already this morning. What are some of the ways that they are, overusing this source?
Yes, it's certainly not just the taps and toilets where this activity is taking place. If we take the mining sector, for example, miners require a large volume of fresh water to actually gain access to the mineral deposits that are in the ground. They use the water to blast the rock in order to get gold or copper out of it. That, of course, then results in a huge amount of very, very dirty, polluted water. And as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of water is currently leaving sites untreated. In fact, 85% of sites are not treating their water sufficiently, and companies are not acting on the issue of pollution at the rate that they should be. Apparel companies, clothing is another source of one of those other thirsty industries. They use a vast amount of water, both in terms of the production and growing of cotton, but also in the dyeing process, which requires a huge amount of water to get the colours into your beautiful dress that you're wearing today, for example. So one of the common misconceptions or issues around the fashion sector is that it's not so much of an issue. However, one of the biggest contributions we can make as citizens is to move away from fast fashion and to start considering more carefully about the clothes that we wear and how we wear them and how long we keep them. Another industry that's very, very thirsty, of course, is agriculture and food. Agriculture accounts for around 95% of all water use on the planet. And that is a very vital sector, of course. We need water, we need our food in order to grow. But some of that food may not necessarily be fit for the future. The production of animal products, for example, cows and beef, it consumes an awful lot of water. And it also has an implication for deforestation worldwide, where we're having forests being cut down in order to grow the cows or grow the food that the cows need to eat. It's not that the cow itself is drinking a lot of water, but the food that it eats requires an awful lot of water for growing. And so it's a very inefficient use of water. So they're just a few examples. I could reel off oil and gas, energy, Pharmaceuticals and chemicals are also other very, very thirsty industries. And we need them to be innovating, setting bold, ambitious targets to no longer require a huge amount of water, to no longer require a huge amount of pollution to take place in order to succeed in delivering a water secure future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kate, for that thorough breakdown. Before I let you go, very briefly, because you've told us a little bit about the call to action, what has been the response from these big corporate giants?
I think it's rather encouraging. It's not quite where it needs to be. There's definitely room for improvement, but we are seeing some very, very positive trends. The fact that 20% more companies disclosed water-related information in the past year, despite of COVID, was really very encouraging. So we now have more information than we ever have before in order to hold those firms accountable. We're seeing freshwater withdrawals on average starting to telling us that they have kept their water levels at the same or reduced, but pollution requires a huge amount of action, with just 4% of companies actually setting and making progress against pollution targets. They have the tools they need. It's time to get to work.
It is time to get to work. It's now or never. I think the past 12 months have shown us that, haven't they? Kate Lamb, Global Director of Water Security at CDP. Thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global. Thank you, Kate. Sadly, that's all we have time for today, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channels Business Global. Goodbye.